Is the Bible a reliable text? That is the subject before us this evening, and I believe it will prove to be a most fascinating one. You know, it's true to say that not a single piece of the original Bible exists today. The book that we call the Bible here in Australia is the translation of the compilation, of the duplication of other copies of what God once instructed his people, the prophets, to write down over 1900 years ago. And so tonight we put to you the question, how do we know that the Bible we have today is a reliable representation of the Bible that God caused to be written down so many years ago? It's one thing to claim that the Bible is authoritative as God's word to mankind, as we did last week. But it's quite another to explain the relationship of the book upon our laps this evening to the original words of God that he spoke around 2,000 years ago or longer. And so tonight we have a fascinating topic and an incredible challenge before us. We need to trace the passage of this book throughout time to find out whether we can still rely upon it as God's words to us. Well, there was a series of events, in the transfer of God's words from him to us. And in order for us to answer our question this evening, we're going to need to examine at least 4 of these 5 stages together. It all begins with the inspiration of the Bible. That is, finding and examining the evidence that the Bible was actually given by God, that it was originally his words to mankind. This, of course, is the foundation question, because if it wasn't God's word in the first place, then the rest of the discussion is of no consequence. And for that reason, we devoted an entire session to the question of the Bible's claim to be authoritatively the Word of God last week. And regularly we discuss fulfilled Bible prophecy and other evidences for that claim of divine inspiration. But tonight, for the sake of time, we must work on the assumption that we're going to begin with God's inspired Word. And then the focus of our evening together are going to be these next 4 stages. Beginning with the documentation of the text. This describes the methods and the materials used by the people of God to write down the Bible in the first place. And we'll begin with a brief look at this together shortly. Then there's the process of selecting and compiling all the different inspired texts to form the Bible. This process is known as canonization. Next, we need to examine the preservation of the Bible. How is it kept safe and copied accurately over time? And finally, as English-speaking Australians, our discussion would be incomplete if we didn't consider the translation of the Bible and its effect upon the reliability of the text. It's been taken from the original Hebrew, Greek and Aramaic languages and translated into our own tongue. And so let's commence our examination of the documentation, the canonization, the preservation and the translation of the Bible throughout the centuries to work out whether we can trust that this book is indeed God's word to us. Now, as we go, given that most likely none of us here are experts in the field, we will of course need to make frequent reference to those who are, to people who have devoted their lives to examining this question and to the study of ancient manuscripts and of how God's word came to us. For the purposes of tonight's discussion, we begin, as we said, with the inspired word of God. And the task of faithfully transmitting that word begins with its initial capture in written forms, the documentation phase. That task becomes all the more interesting when we stop and think about the fact that it wasn't possible for people of those times to simply type in what God said to them, press save, and then open the file 1,000 years later and find before them the uncorrupted word of God. Even paper was only an invention of relatively recent times. And so the documentation of Scripture was no simple task, and it is a significant part of our story. The Bible is comprised of 66 smaller books, the writing of which began in around 1400 BC with the penning of the first 5 books of Moses. It was completed around 1,500 years later in around the year AD 96, with Revelation, the final book of the Bible, penned by the Apostle John. And so we need to look at the history of writing materials from 1400 BC all the way through to our time to understand how the text of the Bible has been transmitted through to us. We don't need to look far to learn the history of writing and of the raw materials that were used. This page here, taken from the University of Adelaide, summarises nicely the technological development of the key writing materials throughout history. And to summarise what we find in that article, the first form of paper was developed in Egypt some 5,000 years ago, in around the year 3000 BC. This product, known as papyrus, was almost like a thin sheet of cardboard. Before this time, only clay tablets, stone walls, or even broken pieces of pottery and such like could be used to preserve written communication. But with the invention of papyrus, a global revolution began in the world of writing. Words could now be easily written down with an ancient type of ink and stored or transported more efficiently. Papyrus was constructed by slicing up a reed-like plant that was found prolific in the Nile Delta of Egypt, and then they would lay these strips at right angles to each other and paint them with a paste of wheat flour, vinegar, and muddy water from the Nile. The strips would then be left out in the sun to dry, under pressure, or hammered together. And then at the end they would be polished with a stone. And the final product was a rather coarse type of paper, which, despite its tendency to crack and its limited durability, it far excelled the quality of any rival materials at the time, so that Egypt became the global exporter of writing materials for many centuries. Almost 3,000 years later, however, a new writing material, or a new writing surface emerged. And it was actually developed out of a conflict between two kingdoms. In around 190 BC, Eumenes II, who was the king of Pergamon in modern-day Turkey, just up here, he had an argument. So he was actually constructing a great library at the time, and because of this library, he had an argument with the king of Egypt, Ptolemy V. You see, Ptolemy V boasted the greatest library in the world at the time, the Library of Alexandria. And in order to prevent his library down in Egypt being excelled, Ptolemy cut off the export of papyrus from Egypt. And so, to pursue his endeavour, King Eumenes was forced to innovate. And his men set to work refining the process by which animal skins were carefully cleaned and then thinned out, stretched out on a rack, in order to form parchment as a new writing surface. These parchments, it turned out, had a distinct advantage over papyrus, in that they were more durable, and they were also much easier to bind together to form books. And so parchment became the staple for important works, such as biblical documents. Just out of interest, it wasn't until 300 years later that the first type of paper was invented across in China. And then it was another 1,000 years until that technology reached the European continent. And so the Bible has, for the majority of its existence, been preserved upon sheets of papyrus or parchment, bound together either as scrolls or books, which were known as codexes. You can see one pictured there on the right. As we'll find, the problem with both of these mediums was their limited durability, not just for Bible texts, but in fact for every text in history. Well, once God's words had been written down by the various prophets, who decided which of them should be included to form the completed Bible? The Bible wasn't just written as one continuous book from Genesis through to Revelation. No, it's the compilation of 66 individual books, penned across 1,500 years, as we said, and involving at least 40 different authors. So who would choose which books should be included? Well, as we said earlier, this process is known as canonization, and the complete Bible is often referred to as the canon of Scripture. The word canon was originally a Greek word, meaning a reed, as Matt mentioned a couple of weeks ago. The reed was a type of measuring rod, and it came to mean the standard by which things were measured. Hence, the canon of Scripture is the standard, or the officially accepted list of books. You may be aware that there were some books which were excluded from this canon. Today they are generally known as the Apocrypha. So how then do we know that we've got the right books in our Bible today? Well, the canonization of the Bible occurred in two stages, with the formation of the Old Testament first, and later the consolidation of the New Testament. So let's briefly look at how each of these two halves of the Bible were compiled. And we're going to start with the second half, the New Testament, for the simple reason that there is more information recorded about its compilation by historical sources, due to the fact that it is, of course, more recent than the Old Testament. Well, the New Testament was compiled during the first 4 centuries after Christ. It may surprise you to learn that it wasn't just a case of all the Bible books being stamped with an inspired stamp, but rather believers in Jesus Christ in the first few centuries AD had to work out which books were and which books were not inspired. Initially, when a group of believers received a letter from an apostle of Jesus Christ who had the Holy Spirit, and who could, of course, do miracles because of that, such as people like Peter and Paul, it would have been obvious to those groups of believers that the letter was inspired. But as time went on, the distinction between inspired and non-inspired texts would have become more clouded as the apostles died out one by one and a new generation arose who didn't know them. Also with time, the importance of a recognised standard or canon of the inspired New Testament writings only grew. The early Christian believers had many problems to address within their gatherings, and they needed to know which books would serve as the source of their authority as they tried to deal with all of these problems. There were also heretics who arose that they had to deal with. Spurious letters were circulated amongst these groups, a New Testament apocryphal collection, and clarity became essential as to what made up the real New Testament. Then, in around the year 300 AD, persecution arose with the Edict of Diocletian, calling for the destruction of the sacred books of the Christians. Now they really needed to know which books they should be prepared to die for and which were not sacred books that they could simply hand over. And so, over these first few centuries, the Christian believers began to clarify amongst themselves which books were or were not inspired. Now, it was not a process of random selection. The decision was founded upon a number of clear principles, the first and most important of which was the necessity for apostolic authorship. If it wasn't written by an apostle, that is, someone sent out with authority by Jesus Christ to preach, well, then it wasn't inspired. And so there were 5 questions that we can identify that guided the inclusion of different books into the New Testament scriptures. The first was, was the book written by a prophet of God? Was it of apostolic origin? If not, then it had to be dispensed with. In fact, we're told that their motto was, if in doubt, throw it out. The second question was the writer confirmed by acts of God? Could they perform miracles to validate their authority? The third, did the message tell the truth about God? The message taught by that particular book had to harmonise with the rest of Scripture in what it taught about God. The fourth question they would ask is, does it come with the power of God? And finally, was it accepted by the people of God? If the early believers regarded a letter as fake, well, then it probably was fake. And so, when in doubt, they threw it out. Well, over the first few hundred years, we can identify historical markers as to the formation of the New Testament canon. Now, given that we weren't alive at the time, we have to rely upon the clues that have been preserved by historians and early church teachers of the day. They were known as the Church Fathers. And we need to rely on them telling us that the New Testament canon of 27 books was consolidated. However, it is possible, of course, that the list of 27 books that makes up the New Testament canon was formed earlier than some of these recorded landmarks that we're about to consider. The New Testament books were written over a period of around half a century from AD 44 being the earliest through to Revelation in AD 96. And it isn't long after that time that we have our first reference outside of the Bible to the New Testament writings as being part of God's Word. Polycarp, the personal disciple of the Apostle John, who was alive around AD 115, just 20 years after Revelation, he referred to the Old Testament and to the New Testament as the Scriptures in his writings. Also at about the same time, Ignatius, he acknowledged the difference between the commentators, the people who would write about the Bible, such as the Church Fathers, and the Apostles themselves, when he said, "I, Ignatius, do not issue orders like an apostle." He recognised that there was a difference between the authority of the apostles to issue divine commands and others. Then there was Justin Martyr, in around AD 100 through to 165, who wrote of the memoirs of the apostles and the writings of the prophets. And he said that every Sunday morning they would meet together and they would read these in their gatherings. The writings of Irenaeus, a little later again, in around AD 180, attest the canonical recognition of the fourfold Gospel and Acts, and many, though not all, of the epistles. Now, Irenaeus' writings are particularly significant because he was the disciple of Polycarp, who was the disciple of the Apostle John. So Irenaeus is relatively closely related to the apostolic age, and Irenaeus confirms all but 8 of the 27 books in the New Testament as being part of this canon of Scripture. The only ones he misses out, for interest, are Philemon, Hebrews, James, 2 Peter, 2 and 3 John, and the letter of Jude. Everything else is mentioned by Irenaeus as being part of the canon of Scripture. Now, of course, the exclusion of those 8 doesn't prove that they were not part of the canon at the time, but we simply don't know from his writings that they were. Well, about 70 years later, in 249 AD, a chap by the name of Origen listed 27 New Testament books. A century later again, Athanasius of Alexandria in Egypt, he gave a list of the New Testament books that is exactly like our present New Testament. This was then ratified by 2 other eminent Christian scholars, Jerome, who we'll see a little later, translated the Latin Vulgate, and Augustine in the late 300s AD. And finally, it was officially accepted by the Christian Church at the Synod of Hippo in AD 393. And the New Testament scholar F.F. Bruce makes an interesting comment about this synod, or meeting, of the church. He says, "When at last a church council, the Synod of Hippo in 393 AD, listed the 27 books of the New Testament, it did not confer upon them any authority which they did not already possess, but simply recorded their previously established canonicity." Now that's an important point for us to bear in mind as we look at this process of canonisation. The early Christian believers did not make any of the books part of the canon of the Word of God. They simply identified which books had been written by men of God, the apostles, and collated them over time into the New Testament that we have today. Well, that then brings us to the canonisation of the Old Testament. The Old Testament is essentially the story of Israel's history, and it was therefore written in their primary language, of Hebrew. It began, as we said earlier, with the giving of the law, recorded by Moses in the first 5 books of the Bible, around 1400 BC. And the Old Testament is believed by the Jews, to have been completed and compiled around 1,000 years later, most probably by Ezra the scribe in about 400 BC. The Jewish Old Testament was structured a little different from our English Bible today. It had exactly the same contents, but in a different layout. The Hebrew Old Testament was made up of only 24 books, and these were divided into 3 groups. First was the law, including Genesis through to Deuteronomy. Then there were the prophets, including both history and prophecy. And then there was the writings, including books of poetry, as well as a few more history books. In our Bibles, we've got 39 books. And the reason for this is that we simply divide 4 of those books, those of Samuel, Kings, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles, into 2 each. And then we split up the 12 into the 12 individual minor prophets, making a total of 39 books of the Old Testament. But again, we have to ask the question, how do we know that these books are the right ones that belong in the Old Testament? Well, once again, there are a number of very helpful clues, both from within and from outside the Bible, that help us learn why the Old Testament on our laps is complete. The first data points relate to this threefold division of the Hebrew Bible into the law, the prophets, and the writings. This is frequently referred to both in the New Testament and also in extra-biblical history. For example, the New Testament often refers to the law of Moses and the prophets together. In fact, it does so no less than 10 times. Jesus Christ referred to this threefold division of the Old Testament canon in Luke 24 and verse 44, when he spoke of the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. And there he takes the Psalms, which you can see from our slide here, is the first in the group of the writings, and it's also the largest book in that section. It appears that the Lord Jesus Christ uses the book of the Psalms to represent the remainder of the writings. Outside the Bible, we find this threefold division is again well attested to. A collection of scrolls found by the Dead Sea, which we'll discuss a little later on, refer to the book of Moses, the books of the prophets, and of David, who of course was the primary author of the Psalms, and that was back in 150 BC. Ecclesiasticus, another historical work written in around 130 BC, refers to the law and the prophets and the other books of our ancestors. And then there's the Jewish philosopher Philo, who lived around 50 AD, and he spoke of that threefold division, as did Josephus, the Jewish historian, in around 100 AD. So it was evidently commonly accepted that the Old Testament was comprised of these three groups: the law, the prophets, and the writings. There's another very interesting reference by Jesus Christ to the Old Testament, which indicates that he viewed the Jewish Old Testament as complete. Now, before we think about that one, just notice here, the first book in the Jewish Old Testament was Genesis, and contrary to our English version, the last book in the Hebrew Old Testament was the book of Chronicles. Well, we're not going to look it up now, but in Luke chapter 11, verses 50 to 51, speaking to the people of his day who were going to kill him as the Son of God, Jesus refers to two stories from the Jewish Old Testament to show that the people of his day were going to pay a bit of price for killing him as God's son. And in doing so, he said that the people of his day were going to be held accountable for the blood of all the prophets that have been murdered, from the blood of Abel, that's a reference to the first murder in the Old Testament, recorded in Genesis chapter 4, unto the blood of Zacharias. And that's the story of a man who was killed at the end of the Jewish Old Testament in 2 Chronicles chapter 24. And Jesus said, you're going to be accountable for the death of all of God's prophets from the start to the end of the Jewish Old Testament. So once again, from the way that Jesus used those two references, it's clear that he believed that the Old Testament of his day was complete. It's also clear from reading the New Testament that Jesus frequently disagreed with the oral traditions and interpretations of the Jewish religious leaders, but never once did he challenge their concept of the Hebrew canon. In fact, the New Testament refers to the scriptures over 50 times, all of those times in relation to the Old Testament, indicating that the Old Testament canon was a recognised work by this time. And then, of course, there are the prolific citations of the Old Testament made by Jesus and others in the New Testament, which shows very clearly that they believed that the Old Testament books that they were quoting were part of this Hebrew canon. One scholar has compiled a list of 719 quotations of the Old Testament in the New Testament. And I've listed them out here on the screen. You can see there's an awful lot of references from the New Testament back into the Old. But we don't find such prolific reference to works outside of Scripture. Once again, illustrating that the New Testament believers revered the Old Testament Scriptures as the completed Old Testament of the Word of God. But there's more than that. Many of these Old Testament citations are specifically described as a reference to Scripture. So here we've got a table with some of them. You're not meant to be able to digest everything that's going on in this table, but in the left-hand column, we have the New Testament reference that we're referring to. Then we've got how this New Testament reference describes this Old Testament reference. And you'll notice the whole way down, it's describing these Old Testament passages as the Scripture. Thus saith the Scripture. And finally, we've noted which portion of the Hebrew Bible each of these citations come from. And so we can see that the books from all three divisions of the Old Testament were accepted as the Old Testament Scriptures. Well, following the completion of the Old Testament with the book of Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah and Malachi in around 450 BC, the Talmud, which is a Jewish commentary on the law, states that the Holy Spirit ceased out of Israel. So the Jews believe that with those final prophets, the Old Testament era of inspiration came to a close. Once again, there was a council of Jewish rabbis when they met to discuss which books were eligible to remain in the Old Testament, and this council was held in Jamnia in Israel in AD 90. And finally, in the year 170 AD, Melito, a bishop in Sardis, once again in modern-day Turkey, very helpfully provides for us a list of the books of the Old Testament, in which he includes all but the book of Esther. Just for later reference, if you'd like it, here's the references that we referred to on our last slide. Well, after reviewing all of that data in his excellent book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, Josh McDowell concludes that the evidence clearly supports the theory that the Hebrew canon was established more than likely as early as the 4th century BC, and certainly no later than 150 BC. And so we have the completed Old and New Testaments of the Bible. It's worth noting, however, that there were some books which didn't make it into the canon of Scripture. Here, for example, is a list of the books that were left out of the Old Testament. They are termed the apocryphal books, meaning the hidden books. And they're excluded from the canon for a number of very good reasons. And some of these are summarised for us in Unger's Bible Dictionary. They contained clear historical and geographical inaccuracies. They taught false doctrines and practices that contradicted other parts of the Bible. Their content was of an artificial nature. It was different from the rest of Scripture, and it lacked the prophetic power and the poetic and religious feeling of the canonical texts. But there were more reasons for their exclusion, and some of them very significant reasons. We saw the plethora of New Testament citations of the Old a little earlier. There are hundreds of them, and yet no New Testament writer quotes the Apocrypha. Now, I did read one article that tried to suggest that the New Testament quotes from the Apocrypha around 40 times, but the author had made tenuous links at best. They just didn't match up like the Old and New Testament citations do. The apocryphal books were rejected by the Council of Jamnia in AD 90. They were rejected by the early church fathers. They were rejected by Jerome when he translated his Latin Vulgate, and more recently by Luther and the other reformers. And it wasn't until less than 500 years ago that the Roman Catholic Church officially adopted the apocryphal books as part of their canon of Scripture. Well, having seen how the Bible was compiled, we now turn to the passage to consider the passage of this book throughout time, the preservation of the Bible. As you can no doubt understand, when we start looking for the original Bible texts, we just don't find them, because papyrus and parchment can rarely last that long. And so we must rely upon copies of the ancient texts, or even copies of copies, to compile the Bible that we read today. Well, the very first group of people who were given the task of preserving the Bible were the early Jewish scribes. They were responsible for both editing, collating, and reproducing the Old Testament manuscripts. Throughout Israel, scribes would often live together in small groups, often with an aesthetic life, and they would carefully copy out the scrolls with little variation between the texts. Then, in around the 6th century AD, a community of Jewish scribes, known as the Masoretes, set about establishing and preserving the correct biblical text. Now, their aim was to gather all of the manuscripts and oral traditions that were available to them and to meticulously compile them into the faithfully reproduced and authentic Word of God. In order to do this, the Masoretes set for themselves extraordinarily strict rules, including the careful ruling of every margin of every page. They'd rule out every line. They would make sure they had the exact spacing between letters and words. Between letters, I should say. There was no spacings between words. And they would count all of the verses, words, and letters of the text. They even noted which was the middle verse, word, and letter, so that they could easily check later on that there had been no changes to the text. If a mistake was made, the entire work had to be started again. They added vowel pointings and marginal notes to preserve the accuracy of the text and enhance the understanding of its readers. Their work spanned around 400 to 500 years, from the 6th to the 10th centuries AD. The texts produced by the Masoretes, known of course as the Masoretic texts, were the only significant available texts of the Old Testament for over 1,000 years, until the year 1947. And in that year, the unimaginable happened. In what would have to be one of the greatest archaeological finds of the 20th century, a young shepherd boy grazing his sheep near Qumran on the northwestern shores of the Dead Sea in Israel entered a cave and stumbled across some clay jars containing ancient scrolls. Those scrolls were texts that were over 2,000 years old. In all, 15,000 fragments representing some 800 to 900 original scrolls, original manuscripts, were recovered from the Qumran caves, most of them having been penned in the 3rd to the 1st centuries BC. Every book of the Bible was represented except the book of Esther. Prior to their find, the oldest complete copy of the Hebrew Old Testament was from 1008 AD, over 1,400 years after the completion of the Old Testament. And as McDowell and Stewart observe, there are, they're in the middle paragraph in our citation on the screen. They say the Dead Sea Scrolls now close that gap by 1,000 years. They left the world waiting to see if the text had been transmitted accurately by the Masoretes. And the answer was a resounding yes. And so between the conscientiousness of the Masorete scribes and the verification of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we can be confident that the Hebrew text of the Old Testament has, amazingly, been faithfully reproduced across thousands of years to our time. So what then are the New Testament texts? The New Testament manuscripts have their own story, starting from a trail of evidence in the centuries after Christ. And here we have a list of some of the primary manuscripts from the first 4 centuries AD. The John Rylands manuscript, in the top row of our table, contains a very small portion of John's Gospel, and it's significant as being the earliest biblical manuscript of the New Testament extant today, dating all the way back to 130 AD, just 100 years after Christ was walking on the earth. Then there's the Bodmer Papyrus, which includes most of John's Gospel. That's followed by the Diatessaron, which is a harmony of the Gospels dating back to 170 AD. The Chester Beatty Papyri was a big find when it was discovered in 1931, as it contained large portions of the New Testament dating back to 200 AD, which these parts of the New Testament have hitherto only been accessible from 300 to 400 AD in those last 3 books that we've got listed there, Codex Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, and Alexandrinus. And each of those last 3 books were large books which contained manuscripts of almost the entire Bible. And so between the Chester Beatty Papyri and those 3 codices listed there, we have almost 4 separate versions of the New Testament dating from just a few centuries after Christ. There were, however, many more manuscripts in later centuries. The New Testament was written in Greek, but it was translated into a whole suite of other languages, as we've listed there on the screen. There we've put up the approximate date of the earliest manuscript in each of the different languages. And you can see that most of the dates are from around 300 to 500 AD onwards, although some are a little closer to 1,000. But then have a look at the number of manuscripts that survive today from each of these different languages. We've got almost 6,000 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament and over 10,000 copies in Latin. In fact, when we add up all the manuscripts of the New Testament in its different languages, we have a total of 23,986. That's 23,986 pieces of evidence, some big, some small, but all of which support the New Testament texts. And then if we were to add the Old Testament as well, we have a total of 66,286 known manuscripts supporting the biblical text. Now let's put that in perspective. Aside from the Bible, the next ancient work with the most manuscripts to back it is Homer's Iliad, which was a poem written about the Trojan War. There are less than 2,000 manuscripts surviving of Homer's Iliad, and even less for other classical works. Take, for example, the history written by the Greek scholar Herodotus. Only around 106 manuscripts survive to this day. Well, in trying to visualise this discrepancy in data, Josh and Sean McDowell, once again in their book Evidence That Demands a Verdict, asked the question, how high do you think a stack of New Testament manuscripts would be? And then they comment on that a stack of extant manuscripts for the average classical writer would measure around 4 feet in height. This just cannot compare to the more than 1 mile of New Testament manuscripts and 2.5 miles for the entire Bible. So here we've got a diagram of some of the tallest buildings in the world, with the Great Pyramid on the left at 139 metres in height, and the tallest building, the Burj Khalifa, which is situated in Dubai, at 830 metres in height. Well, if we were to stack up all of the biblical manuscripts on top of one another, the pile would reach to almost 5 times as high as the tallest building in the world. Compare that to just the average 4-foot tall pile for the classical writer in history, such as Homer's Iliad and Herodotus' works. As one writer comments, the textual critic of the New Testament is embarrassed by the wealth of his material when compared to the other sources. Well, finally, to add to this weight of manuscript evidence that backs the Bible, the eminent Bible scholars Metzer and Ehrman note that there are many scriptural quotations made by the early church fathers. And they comment that if all other sources of our knowledge of the text of the New Testament were destroyed, they would be sufficient alone for the reconstruction of practically the entire New Testament. Another astounding witness to the reliability of the Bible text on our laps today. So long though its story may be, the Bible stands upon textual evidence that is unparalleled in world history and literature. No other text even comes close to the sum of evidence that stands behind the Bible texts. But there is one final part of the story that we must briefly touch on before we leave off our consideration of the reliability of the biblical text before us tonight. And that is its translation into our own language today. As we said earlier, the majority of the Old Testament was written in Hebrew and the New Testament in Greek. And so, of course, the Bible text needed to be translated into our own tongue in order for us to read and to understand it. But as with everything else in the Bible's story, meticulous care was essential. Poor translation, just like flippant copying, could corrupt the Bible text, so that it no longer remains a faithful representation of God's words to us. Well, little happened in the way of translation through the Dark Ages. And during this time, the Roman Catholic Church did all that it could to suppress the access of the common people to the Bible. In 1229 AD, for example, the Council of Bishops decreed that only members of the clergy may own a Bible. But men grew restless under the iron oppression of Catholicism, and in the 13 and 1400s, works were published by early reformers such as John Wycliffe and Erasmus of Rotterdam, sparking others like John Huss and Martin Luther to rise up in opposition to the Catholic Church. With this era of religious and general enlightenment came the translation phase of the Bible's history. Over a millennium before this time, the Old Testament had been translated, as tradition goes, by 72 Jewish elders down in Alexandria in Egypt in around 250 to 150 BC. Whether or not there were 72 elders that were actually involved, the translation was completed prior to the 1st century AD, when the apostles of the New Testament frequently quoted from it. About 500 years later, Pope Damascus I commissioned Jerome in 382 AD to make a revision of the old Latin translations and to produce the Latin Vulgate. This became the primary translation used through the Middle Ages, and it is still used by the Roman Catholic Church today. Well, 1,000 years later, John Wycliffe and his followers translated the Latin Vulgate into English, producing the first complete English Bible. This was to be largely discarded by many Protestant reformers due to its Latin origins. To this point in time, the Word of God, in its documentation and reproduction, had all been in the manuscript form, the handwritten format. But in the year 1456, that all changed. On the eve of the Reformation, Johann Gutenberg invented movable type, which he used with his printing press to produce the first printed Bible, a version of the Latin Vulgate. Prior to this invention, one copy of the Bible would take nearly a year to produce. But with the Reformation, a departure from Catholic beliefs and behaviour, came a departure also from the Latin text as well. The groundwork was laid by Erasmus, a Roman Catholic priest who remained loyal to the Pope and yet objected to the corruption that he saw in the Church. This scholar went back to the Greek manuscripts and constructed the first version of what is now known as the received text, or the majority text, or the Textus Receptus. Erasmus also made a controversial Latin translation alongside his Greek text, posing a challenge to the prestigious Vulgate. The following year, on October the 31st, 1517, Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses against indulgences to the door of Castle Church at Wittenberg, thus commencing, in the eyes of many scholars, the Reformation. William Tyndale, an English scholar inspired by the works of Erasmus and Luther, became convinced that the Bible alone should determine the practices and doctrines of the Church, and that every believer should be able to read the Bible in his own language. The authorities soon put a stop to his translation efforts, and forced to flee Britain for his life, he translated the New Testament and part of the Old, publishing his works in 2 cities of southwestern Germany. As a result, by his betrayal by Henry Phillips, Tyndale's work was cut short, and in 1536 he was strangled and burned to death. His final words were, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." Tyndale's work was not lost, however, for around the time of his death, Miles Coverdale, who knew neither Hebrew nor Greek, printed a Bible based on the Vulgate, Tyndale's work, and some German versions. 2 years later, the Matthew's Bible was produced, the work of John Rogers, a friend of Tyndale, who published a compilation of Tyndale's and Coverdale's work under the name of Thomas Matthew. The Great Bible, published in 1839, was a revision of the Matthew's Bible, which was authorised for distribution in churches. Under Mary Tudor, Queen of England, who tried to reverse the Reformation that had begun under her father, Henry VIII, Protestants fled England. One group, who found themselves in Geneva, produced the Geneva Bible by comparing the Great Bible back to the Hebrew texts. On their return to England, under the reign of Elizabeth I, a further revision was ordered by the Archbishop of Canterbury and led the way to the publication of the Bishop's Bible in 1568. This Bible was to lay the foundation for the translation commissioned by King James I in 1604. Printed in 1611, the King James translators also referenced the Tyndale, Coverdale, Matthews, and Geneva Bibles, as well as the original Greek and Hebrew texts. The result was a Bible that became the standard version for Protestants all over the English-speaking world. Today, with the information boom of today's world, the number of translations has skyrocketed in the last 200 years. As this diagram on the screen illustrates, there are predictably more translations today than ever before, and the rate at which they are being developed is ever increasing. But with the growth of translations, one thing remains constant. The Bible is God's word to us, and our aim should be to access it in its most reliable form. With that in mind, whilst we haven't the time to look at any of these translations in particular, there is one thing that we must bear in mind when choosing our primary Bible from which we choose to read and study God's words to us. And that is that we need to understand the approach that the translators took in translating that Bible. There are essentially two different mentalities when translating the Bible text. The first is that God inspired all of the words, so that the translators need to meticulously translate the words from the ancient text into English. This is called the literal approach to translation, where translators believe that God literally inspired every word of the Bible, and that the only mistakes within it are due to copying or translation errors. The other approach is that God simply inspired the ideas, that he just wants to get the overall point across without caring too much for the specific words. This is called the dynamic approach. And whilst it's easier to read at times, we are forced, if we choose a dynamic translation, to rely upon the thoughts of the translator and what they thought was the key idea in that passage. And so we need to put some thought into the translation that we choose to read from primarily, because there's no point putting in all of that effort to faithfully transmitting the word of God through 2,000 years of history if we then dilute, or worse, change them right at the end. Well, where does that bring us to this evening? I trust you'll agree that we've been on a fascinating journey through the canonisation, documentation, preservation, and finally the translation of God's word, the Bible. The Bible has been remarkably preserved throughout history, so that today we can rely upon it as God's word to us. But we really have to ask what that